All right, so today we're diving into something, well, it's a bit of a head scratcher, to say the least. It's this thing called the liar paradox. And, chances are you've come across it in some form or another. Like, think about this sentence. The first sentence in this discussion is false.
Yeah, that's a classic example,
Oh,
and you immediately run into a problem, right?
exactly. Because if the sentence is true, well, then it must be false, like it says. But hold on, if it's false, then the whole claim that it's false is wrong, which would mean the original sentence is actually true. It's a real logical pretzel.
A real mind bender, that's for sure. And what makes it even more fascinating, at least for us philosophy types, is that this isn't some newfangled puzzle.
Oh, yeah, this thing goes way back, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Ancient, in fact. The Megarians, for example, they were already wrestling with this paradox, and you even find mentions of it in the works of Aristotle and Cicero. And later on, the medieval logicians, think Buridan and those folks, they categorized it as one of insolubilia, basically. Those problems that seem to defy any straightforward solution. So this isn't just a fun little brain teaser. It's a problem that's been haunting philosophers and logicians for centuries.
It really speaks to how fundamental the challenge is, I guess. And then there's that famous Cretan liar paradox, the one with Epimenides saying all Cretans are liars, which has its own little echo in the New Testament. But for our purposes, I think it's important to emphasize that the paradox isn't really about lying in the everyday sense, right? The intentions behind a lie or the social context, that kind of stuff. It digs much deeper than that.
Exactly. This isn't an empirical question about deception. This is about the very structure of truth itself. The machinery we use in language and logic to even talk about what's true and what's not. And it pushes us to consider whether these systems, especially when you throw in self-reference, can actually hold up under scrutiny.
And it's not just a single oddity, right? It's like the liar paradox opens up a whole Pandora's box of these logical conundrums. I mean, the idea that we might have to conclude everything is true just from a seemingly simple statement that's not just a small hiccup in our logic, it suggests there might be a major flaw in the foundation.
Yeah, it really makes you question whether our fundamental logical principles, the bedrock of how we reason, and our understanding of concepts like truth, whether they can actually withstand this kind of intense self-referential pressure. That's a big deal for a philosopher.
So today, we're going deep into this paradox family. We'll be checking out some of its key variations and, well, looking at how some of the big thinkers throughout history have tried to navigate this logical minefield. Now, we can't cover every single proposed solution. That would be a whole other deep dive, maybe a series of them. But we'll hit on the ones that have been particularly influential or have opened up new philosophical avenues.
Right, because even if we don't land on a definitive answer, by picking apart these paradoxes, we get a glimpse into the potential weak points in our logical and semantic systems. It's like stress testing our understanding of truth and meaning.
Perfect. So let's jump right in. We'll start with the core paradox and some of its close cousins. First up, the simple falsity liar. It's often called FLIAR for short, and it simply states, FLIAR is false. Now let's carefully walk through the implications here. You game.
Absolutely, let's do it. So imagine for a second that the sentence FLIAR is false is actually true.
Okay, I'm imagining it. Then what?
Well, if it's true, then what it says must be the case. Meaning FLIAR itself, the sentence FLIAR is false, must actually be false. So you see the problem. If it's true, then it's also false. That directly contradicts the whole principle of non-contradiction, a pretty fundamental rule in logic.
A big no-no in the world of logic.
Yeah.
But what if we flip the script and assume the opposite? What if we say, hey, maybe FLIAR is false is actually false? What happens then?
Well, if the statement FLIAR is false, then that means the assertion that FLIAR is false is wrong, which means FLIAR must actually be true. So we start by assuming it's false and end up concluding it's true. Again, a contradiction. It's like it's trapped in this weird logical loop where it's false if and only if it's true.
It feels like a direct attack on the idea of bivalence. The idea that in logic, every sentence has to be either true or false.
Exactly. FLIAR throws a wrench into that whole system. If a sentence can be both true and false, or maybe neither, depending on how you look at it, then it shakes the very ground classical logic is built on, and it gets worse. In many standard logical systems, if you have a contradiction, you can basically derive anything, any conclusion at all. That's what we call triviality.
Talk about a recipe for chaos.
Yeah.
So that was the simple falsity liar. But there's also the simple untruth liar, Eulier, which says Eulier is not true. Does this really change the game, philosophically speaking?
Not really. It's like a slightly different flavor of the same self-referential mess. If Euler, the sentence Euler is not true is true, then it has to fulfill its own condition, meaning it must actually be not true. Again, contradiction city.
And if we try to say Euler is not true?
Well, then the statement Euler is not true becomes true. And that, of course, means Euler itself is true. So we're back in that same loop. True if and only if it's not true, no escape.
So it seems that whether we use false or not true to negate the sentence, the logical trouble remains the same. Now, these examples we've looked at so far, they all involve a sentence directly commenting on its own truth. But it can get sneakier, right? Like with those liar cycles, the Max and Agnes scenario.
Yeah, those are especially interesting because they show that you don't even need explicit self-reference in a single sentence to run into these paradoxical situations. You have Max who says Agnes's claim is true, and then you have Agnes who says Max's claim is not true.
So it's a two-person paradox tango. Let's unpack that dance move by move. Say Max's statement is true. What happens then?
If Max's statement is true, then Agnes's claim has to be true as well. But if Agnes's claim is true, remember she said Max's claim is not true, then Max's claim can't be true. It's false. So if Max is telling the truth, he's also lying. Contradiction strikes again.
And just to cover all the bases, what if we assume Max is actually lying?
All right, so let's say Max's claim is false. That means Agnes's claim, the one saying Max's claim is not true, has to be false too. But think about it. If Agnes's claim is false, then Max's claim must actually be true. So if Max is lying, he's telling the truth. The contradiction just won't quit. And you see, it all stems from this circular dependency between the two statements.
It's like they're stuck in a logical death spiral, each pulling the other down. So it's not just about a single sentence pointing at itself. It's about this relational breakdown where assigning truth values just leads to a mess. Now let's shift gears a bit and consider the disjunctive liar. We'll call it D-liar. Either D-liar is not true or 1 equals 0.
Ah, yes, the D-liar. Now this one gets really interesting because it throws in an obvious falsehood, 1 equals 0, right in the mix. And this highlights another tricky aspect of these paradoxes, especially for philosophers.
So what's the philosophical takeaway here?
It shows how introducing a clear and undeniable falsehood into a disjunction, that or statement, can cause huge logical problems when combined with self-reference and our usual assumptions about truth.
Okay, walk me through the logical steps. How does this play out?
Let's start by supposing that D-liar is not true. That means the first part of the or statement, D-liar is not true, is actually true. And since an or statement is true, if at least one of its parts is true, this means that D-liar itself must be true. So here we are again. If D-liar is not true, then it is true. Our old friend, the contradiction.
So to avoid that contradiction, we have to say D-liar is actually true.
Exactly. But if D-liar is true, then at least one of the two parts of the or statement has to be true as well. But we already saw that if we assume the first part, D-liar is not true, is true, we run into a contradiction. So the only option left is for the second part, 1 equals 0, to be true.
So trying to make sense of the liar sentence within this disjunction forces us to accept a completely false mathematical statement.
Precisely. It's like the paradox spills over, contaminating other areas of knowledge. And this connects to another tricky paradox, Curry's paradox. How do you see that connection playing out philosophically?
Well, I know that Curry's paradox usually uses a conditional statement, something like, if this sentence is true, then 1 equals 0. But it seems like the disjunctive liar and Curry's paradox have a similar structure, don't they?
They do. In logical systems where if P then Q is the same as saying either not P or Q, that's called the material conditional D-liar, and the Kerr sentence become logically equivalent. They both show that self-reference, combined with what seem like harmless logical connectors, can allow a sentence to basically force us to accept any arbitrary statement, even a blatant falsehood, as true, and that raises some deep questions about our theories of truth and implication.
So the liar isn't just messing with our understanding of truth. It's messing with our understanding of logical connections themselves. Now there's another one, Diablo's paradox, with its infinite sequence of claims. From a philosopher's perspective, especially when thinking about self-reference, how do we even approach this paradox, since it doesn't seem circular in the usual way?
Right. Diablo's paradox is kind of unique. It seems to produce a contradiction without that direct self-reference you see in the simpler liar sentences or the immediate circularity of the Max and Agnes case. Imagine an endless chain of statements, 0, A1, A2, and so on. Each statement, AI, says that all the statements after it are not true.
So an infinite chain of untruth claims. Okay, so what happens when we try to figure out if the first statement, A0, is true or false?
Right, let's start there. If A0 is true, then according to what it says, all the statements that come after it, A1, A2, and so on, have to be untrue. But wait, if A1 is untrue, then it's not the case that all the statements following A1 are untrue. That means at least one of them has to be true. And that contradicts our initial assumption that everything after A0 is untrue. So assuming A0 is true leads to a contradiction.
And if we assume E0 is not true...
Okay, let's go that route. If A0 is not true, then it means there has to be at least one true statement somewhere down the line in this infinite sequence. Let's say AK, for some number k, is the first true statement. If AK is true, then all the statements that come after it have to be untrue. But then look at the statement right after AK. We'll call it AK plus 1. Since AK plus 1 is untrue, it can't be the case that all the statements following it are untrue. That means there must be a true statement somewhere after AK plus 1. But that contradicts our assumption that AK was the first true statement. So we hit a contradiction either way.
It's like the paradox is woven into the very fabric of this infinite chain of statements. It doesn't rely on a single sentence referring to itself, but the whole structure itself seems inherently paradoxical.
And that's where the philosophical debate kicks in. Does this infinite chain of dependencies count as a type of hidden self-reference? Or is this a completely new way for paradoxes to emerge? Some philosophers argue that Yablo's paradox ultimately boils down to a kind of generalized self-reference across the whole sequence, while others say, no, this is a genuine case of paradox arising from the complex relationships between the statements without any direct circularity.
So we've seen this whole family of liar paradoxes in all its different forms. It seems to point to some pretty deep issues where language, truth, and logic all intersect. What are the key ingredients that allow us to construct these logical bombs in the first place?
Let's focus on the simpler liars for a moment. From a philosopher's point of view, a few things stand out. First, you need a truth predicate in the language itself. You need a way to actually talk about whether statements are true or not. Usually we represent this with a predicate symbolized as T of X, which basically means X is true. The X here stands for the name of a sentence.
Okay, so we need a way to talk about truth within the language itself. But how do we actually handle these names of sentences when we're doing formal analysis in logic or philosophy?
Well, we usually use a convention where we put corner quotes around a sentence to indicate its name. So if you have a sentence like, the sky is blue, its name would be represented as corner quote, the sky is blue, corner quote, and then T of corner quote, the sky is blue, corner quote, would simply mean the sentence, the sky is blue, is true.
So we can refer to sentences as objects within the language itself. That's crucial. But then what are the basic rules or principles that we assume govern this truth predicate? And how do these rules break down when the liar paradox shows up?
The traditional cornerstone here has been what we call the T schema. It says that a sentence A is materially equivalent to the statement that A is true. In symbols, it looks like this. T of corner quote, A corner quote, if and only if A. It seems intuitively right, and it's been central to a lot of theories of truth, especially Tarski's work.
But as the liar paradox painfully demonstrates, this seemingly simple equivalence blows up when you have self-referential sentences. So when we start exploring alternative logics, how do we refine or maybe even abandon parts of this traditional understanding of truth?
It's helpful to break the T schema down into two separate principles, capture and release. Capture says that if a sentence A is true, then the statement A is true is also true in symbols. A, therefore T of corner quote, A, corner quote. Release is the flip side. If A is true, then A itself is true, symbolically. T of corner quote, therefore A. The therefore symbol here represents logical consequence or implication within whatever logical system we're working with.
And the way we define that therefore, the implication, is really important because it can change drastically depending on the logic we're using.
Absolutely. In classical logic, capture and release, when combined, are basically the same as the T schema. But in non-classical logics, you might choose to reject one or both of these principles to try to sidestep the liar paradox. For example, some paracomplete logics. They're logics where sentences don't always have to be true or false. They might reject capture. They allow for situations where a sentence might be true, but the statement that it's true is not necessarily true itself. And then you have paraconsistent logics, which are designed to handle contradictions without everything falling apart. They might accept both capture and release, even when there are contradictions, but they prevent the whole system from collapsing into triviality.
So we have these core components, a truth predicate and the rules that govern it. With those in place, how does the simple untruth liar actually emerge in a more abstract logical derivation? Can we see the paradox being built step by step?
If a language has enough expressive power to talk about its own syntax and it includes a truth predicate, we can create a sentence, let's call it L, which is logically equivalent to the statement L is not true. In symbols, L if and only if not T of corner quote, L corner quote. This equivalence is the key to the whole paradox.
So we've built this self-referential sentence, but then how does the standard logical machinery lead us to a contradiction?
Well, we typically rely on some fundamental principles like the law of excluded middle, or lem. Lem says every sentence is either true or false. And then there's the principle of explosion in Latin, ex falso quodlibet, which says that if you have a contradiction, you can derive any conclusion whatsoever. Other rules like the disjunction principle and adjunction also often come into play.
Okay, so let's see how this abstract derivation plays out. Where do we start?
We begin with lem. It tells us that either T of corner quote, L corner quote is true, or not T of corner quote, L corner quote is true. Those are the only two possibilities. Let's consider the first case, where T of corner quote, L corner quote is true. By the release principle, this means that L itself has to be true. But remember, by its very definition, L is equivalent to not T of corner quote, L corner quote. So we start with T of corner quote, L corner quote, and end up deriving not T of corner quote, L corner quote. That's a contradiction.
All right, so the first case leads to a contradiction. What about the second case where not T of corner quote, L corner quote is true?
Well, if not T of corner quote, L corner quote is true, then by the definition of L itself has to be true. And by the capture principle, if L is true, then T of corner quote, L corner quote has to be true as well. So once again, we get a contradiction. Not T of corner quote, L corner quote, and T of corner quote, L corner quote are both true. And since both possible cases from lem lead to a contradiction, we can conclude that there's a contradiction in the system itself.
The logical trap is sprung. And then to make matters worse, we apply the principle of explosion. Because of this contradiction, we can now derive any sentence we want, any conclusion at all. That's how serious a threat the liar paradox poses to the consistency of our logical systems. Right. It's not just a theoretical curiosity, it's a logical wrecking ball.
And that's exactly why it's been such a major focus in philosophy.
Right, because given how destabilizing this paradox is, what's the broader philosophical significance of the liar? Why has it captivated thinkers for so long?
The liar paradox has been incredibly influential, pushing philosophical inquiry in several directions. For example, it's been used in arguments about the inherent limitations of formal systems, kind of like Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Some philosophers have even argued that it reveals a fundamental incoherence in how we usually think about truth, suggesting that truth might be inherently vague or context-dependent. It's also fueled debates about what it means to truly understand and use language, what we call semantic competence, and whether it's even possible to define things coherently when self-reference enters the picture.
So it's definitely not just a puzzle for logicians stuck in the world of symbols and formal systems.
Definitely not. While it does pose a major challenge to formal logic, its implications reach far beyond that. It touches on deep philosophical questions about knowledge, language, and the nature of reality itself. Remember Tarski. His response was to propose a hierarchical theory of truth, basically creating levels of language to avoid self-reference. That approach suggests a pretty radical departure from how we normally conceive of truth. More often, though, philosophers have taken the liar paradox as a sign that our basic principles about truth, especially the unrestricted T-schema, need to be refined or limited in some way.
And that's led to the development of all sorts of alternative logics, right?
Exactly. The liar paradox has been a driving force behind the exploration of non-classical logics. Paracomplete logics, as we mentioned, try to solve the problem by saying, hey, maybe some sentences aren't simply true or false. They allow for truth-value gaps. Then there are paraconsistent logics, which try to handle contradictions without everything exploding. They allow for theories that can tolerate some degree of inconsistency. And some philosophers have tried to stick with classical logic, but by carefully restricting the conditions under which self-referential statements can be formed or evaluated, it's all about finding ways to contain the paradox.
It's clear that this seemingly simple paradox has had a huge and lasting impact on philosophy and logic.
It's a constant reminder that even our most fundamental concepts, like truth and logical reasoning, have hidden complexities. And it keeps us on our toes, philosophically speaking.
So we've journeyed through this intricate maze of the liar paradox, examining its different forms and pinpointing the essential elements that make it paradoxical. We've seen how a simple idea can spiral into deep logical challenges, forcing us to question our assumptions about truth and reasoning.
And as we've discussed, throughout history, philosophers and logicians have come up with all sorts of ingenious and often conflicting solutions to this age-old puzzle. Each attempt offers valuable insights into the nature of language, truth, and the limits of formal systems.
And now, for all of you out there pondering this alongside us, we leave you with this question. Which aspect of the liar paradox do you find most philosophically challenging? Is it the self-reference that seems to set off the contradiction, the slippery nature of truth itself that the paradox exposes, or maybe the apparent fragility of the logical principles we usually take for granted?
And as you continue to ponder this, here's a final thought for you to chew on. Could the very existence of the liar paradox point to a fundamental limit in our ability to fully and consistently grasp the concept of truth using language? Maybe there are inherent boundaries in language, where self-reference, when applied to truth, inevitably leads us into paradoxical territory. And maybe our current linguistic and logical frameworks just aren't equipped to navigate those treacherous waters.